No, I don't. It's okay, yeah, we gotta keep it up. I just wonder if we should wait a couple minutes since it's right after lunch, or?
Up to you.
Okay. Okay, I'm supposed to give you guys all a 1-minute warning, so we're going to start in 1 minute, and I'm also to remind you to shut off or silence your cell phones, please. So we'll start in just a second. So Lisa, introduce yourself. You're going to start, and I'll go second. Okay. Should I start now? Wait a second. Okay. When you feel ready. I'm sort of never going
Do you think you could move the chairs a little closer before you start? Thank you
Cozy.
very much.
Yeah.
Cozy.
Yeah.
Much better.
Elbows.
We're friends.
It's a good thing.
So I think we'll start. Thank you so much for coming. This is a really wondrous conference, and we feel very grateful to have been invited, and also very grateful that of all the many wonderful things that I know you were drawn by, you chose to come here, and we're very thankful that you've done that. So my name's Lisa Disch, and I teach in the Department of Political Science, and just for a brief time, women's studies. I'm actually moving all the way into political science. And I am going to, we're going to introduce ourselves just before we give our papers, so we don't have a chair. So, and I wanted to talk today about Christine Delphi, who is a French materialist feminist from the 70s. And I'm going to talk about what I'm calling her constructivist materialism, and overlooked French feminism. So one of the reasons that I think this paper might be of some interest is that we talked this morning about how the women's liberation movement, though central to the revolutionary moment of the time, has been marginalized in historical narratives of feminism and of the New Left and the 60s more broadly as well. We also spoke this morning about how feminism and how liberationist feminism was not merely a US phenomenon, but that it was a global phenomenon. And so Delphi is a central figure in the women's liberation movement in France, which was called exactly that. It was named by the French media as the Women's Liberation Movement. I mean, obviously it was MLF there, the French acronym. But so it was named after the US movement, and the women who were part of the women's liberation movement in France for the most part, it is not their writings and their work that we associate with French feminism in the US. It's actually more the work of a group called Psyché-Po, which was a psychoanalytic, basically, version, I'm just really doing shortcuts here, of feminism that came over to us because of the way that French feminism reached us through departments of literary criticism in the late 70s and 80s. So looking back at the MLF, the Women's Liberation Movement in France, can dispel some myths, since that's another theme that we have today, dispelling myths about the 70s. It can dispel some myths that we have about the feminist movement. One of those is that women's liberation was based firmly in sex, and that the deconstruction of sex by the concept of gender is a latecomer. That myth can be dispelled by Delphi's work, as I'm about to argue. Well, actually, that's the main thing that I wanted to say, that myth can be dispelled by Delphi's argument. So, in the late 1960s, French materialist feminists began practicing a distinctively constructivist materialism. So this makes it very interesting because we might think that constructivism and materialism are at odds, but for these French feminists, the two went together. How? These feminists were constructivists because they maintained that gender, I'm quoting, is not constructed on the apparently natural category of sex, male and female, but rather sex has become a perceived fact and hence a perceived category because of the existence of gender. So these French feminists in the late 70s were already saying that we notice sex, we believe sex to be foundational because gender is constructing our ways of differentiating bodies in society. So that's what made them constructivists. They were materialists because they theorized women's oppression by patriarchy. And they defined patriarchy as a sex-differentiated division of labor that exploits wives through the institution of compulsory unpaid housework in marriage. They noted that patriarchal marriage did more than render wives economically dependent on their husbands. It also had labor market effects, relegating wives to a subordinate position in paid labor, supplementary income, part-time work, higher rates of unemployment. These thinkers were also notorious for maintaining that gender is a social class to which all women belong. So they did have that unitary statement about women, that all women were members of the same class by virtue of gender. Now, I argue that the French materialist feminists are interesting to read today because of their unique approach to thinking about gender as a principle of partition. And I'll say a little bit later what is meant by that. And that they combined this analysis of gender as a principle of partition with their analysis of patriarchy. So theirs is a conceptual, abstract analysis together with a sociological, it's okay, analysis of a mode of production. Now, admittedly, French materialism might seem an unlikely source of insight, especially in light of the gender as class mantra, which we are all sensitized to be allergic to for the many differences among women that such things can elide. And in fact, Kathi Weeks has argued in reference to dual systems theory arguments of the same period in the US, which are very similar arguments, that feminist analyses of the division between domestic and wage labor succeeded in producing a map of Fordism after it was over. Delphi's most famous work on household labor will seem even more anachronistic than the US analyses because it was based not on Fordism but on the pre-Fordist domestic economy of agricultural households in rural France. Now, what I find interesting about Delphi and significant to contemporary academic debates is precisely the relationship between her analysis of patriarchy and her critique of sex gender, her idea of gender as a principle of partition. So I point out that Delphi was ahead of Judith Butler in deconstructing the sex-gender opposition. So, and it's interesting that Butler is credited with a great, breakthrough that Delphi had arguably already made. And moreover, Delphi makes this deconstruction, not that I of course, benefit greatly from the work of Judith Butler, but it's just interesting that we've forgotten Christine Delphi. And moreover, Delphi does so by means of a social structural rather than a psychoanalytic analysis. So, but this work did not make a big splash in the US, as I mentioned, partly because it just didn't fit within the categories that US feminist scholars were using to map the fields of both feminist theory and critical theory in the 1990s. So these scholars would have fit somewhere in feminist critical theory, but the way we were mapping those fields, critical theory was, to us, we were looking more to Germany to find that. And feminist theory, French feminism was for us the psychoanalytic theory. They kind of fell through the cracks. But what's truly interesting about Delphi's story is that even among feminists in France, Delphi reports that she struggled to convey the distinctiveness of her argument. And what I do in the paper from which this talk is drawn is to trace that struggle that Delphi tells you the story of. And I look primarily at the preface to The Principal Enemy, Volume 2, where Delphi actually narrates the intellectual journey that carried her from her early thinking on sex gender to her later, I will argue, differential analysis of difference. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So that is to say, Delphi narrates how she shifted her focus from analyzing how groups come to be in relations of power with other groups to analyzing the power that's at work in the very process of grouping, in the very process of saying this is a difference that makes a group. So what is, I've labeled Delphi and these other French materialists constructivist materialists. What do I mean by that? It is material analysis premised on the conviction that sex difference is not the substrate or basis of hierarchy, it's the effect of gender hierarchy. The ingenuity of this constructivist materialist position is that they deny the materiality of sex in order to make a materialist analysis of gender. So it's not that materialism should bring us back to the body and therefore sex. It's that materialism, which may well bring us back to the body, should bring us straight to gender. That's the unusual claim. Delphi makes this move by proposing to conceive gender in a unique and distinctive way as the principle of partition. As a principle of partition, gender is active. Gender does not rest on, express, or in any other way presuppose sex difference. Gender cuts in two. It partitions. And so it creates difference, and I mean difference in the singular, where there would otherwise be differences. Delphi illustrates the distinction between the singular and plural forms of difference and its political importance with a vegetable analogy that I'm going to read to you. Yes. She says, differentiations can be and often are multiple. Alongside cabbages and carrots, which are not opposites of each other, there are courgette, melon, and potatoes. Moreover, distinctions are not necessarily hierarchical. Vegetables are not placed on a scale of value. So differentiation as a phenomenon is multiple and plural. Differences are randomly distributed. By contrast, difference is already organized normatively in relation to power. It is dichotomous and more or less explicitly hierarchical. At its most radical, then, this notion of gender as a principle of partition argues that gender lends sex systematic significance as a dividing line between entities. That is, gender lends sex significance as a group difference, a basis for grouping. This is what I mean when I characterize Delphi's conception of gender as differential. It explains how groups are produced. It took Delphi a long time to arrive at this point, however, and to convince her colleagues that it was distinctive and important. And in her remarkable preface to the principle, The Main Enemy, Part 2, she gives an account of the development of her thought. The preface begins with Delphi narrating her own inability to grasp, theoretically, in terms of the feminist conceptions of sex oppression that were available to her at the time, the significance of her empirical research. So she was doing this empirical research on division of labor in the household, and she felt that the concepts that feminism made available to her were not adequate to expressing what she was finding. The research taught her that the fact that women perform domestic labor, and that they do it for free, owes nothing whatsoever to nature, and everything to a social organization that dictates that they do it. Sex is not the ground of the division of labor between men and women, but rather the effect of patriarchal hierarchy. Delphi explains it this way in 1984, so before this preface that I'm talking about. Some talk of men and women as being groups, but the term group says nothing about their mode of constitution. It can be thought that having already come into existence, they later enter into a relationship, and that this relationship at a still later time becomes characterized by domination. Delphi's way of thinking about sex inverts this scheme by positing that groups do not first exist and then come into a relationship of domination, but rather it is their relationship of domination which constitutes them as groups in the first place. How does Delphi move from an interest in relations of oppression between groups to a concern with grouping per se? She has been accustomed to argue that persons are sexed, and that oppression occurs wherever sexed persons are subject to one another by gendering, i.e. by the division into a hierarchical opposition of sex. Now, Delphi concedes that it took years of pursuing the implications of my own work while benefiting from the contributions of others working in the same direction before she would conceive of what she termed the thoroughgoing anti-naturalist thesis, quote, that this dictate did not apply to ready-made persons, to women pre-existing their oppression. Rather, this dictate constructed them at the same time as it constrained them. At last, she writes, I concluded that females and males are themselves social constructions. Now, just what made this argument so new? Delphi explained that most people, including professors at the Collège de France, study only relations between groups. Thus, they postulate without saying that the question of the constitution of those groups has been settled. It's natural. She presents this as running contrary to the nodal point of her corpus. And I will again read a quote from her. It is in the same moment and by the same moment that groups are created, and created as dominated or dominant. The question of difference or of differences can no longer be asked, or more precisely, it has to be asked in an entirely different way, one in which differences can no longer have any causal role whatsoever in hierarchy because they do not pre-exist it. Delphi is making two distinct claims about the work of partitioning that she has attributed to gender. It is not simply that gender constructs sex as natural, although she is saying that. It is also that it constitutes men and women as groups by creating sex difference as group difference. The distinction here is subtle but important. It is one thing to argue, as Delphi did early on, that anatomical sex difference becomes charged with social meaning by virtue of gender. This assumes what it has to prove, which is that sex is already the kind of difference that lends itself to moving from the specific to the general. And indeed, we do always already assume that anatomical sex pertains to more than genitals. So we already do make that assumption that sex can be generalized. So we treat sex, unlike other such distinguishing bodily features as being right or left-handed, or having blue eyes, or being tone deaf, we treat sex as a predictor for other socially valued aptitudes, such as having a good sense of direction or being good at math. When we make this assumption, we are already endowing sex with the power to group. Delphi's radical claim is that gender works not only by imputing naturalness to social groups and thereby naturalizing social hierarchies, but that it also imbues particular differences, such as race, gender, and ethnicity, with the capacity to signify systematic variation or group difference. In patriarchal ideologies, then, sex is not just naturalized, not just hierarchical, it is also partitioned. It is also a group divider. This move from relational to differential analysis is important, both intellectually and politically. Intellectually, it helps to specify a distinction that I think gets lost in some contemporary versions of new materialism, and that is the distinction between constructivist argumentation and social constructivist argumentation. A social constructivist understands economic identities and interests to drive political groupings and explain political outcomes. The constructivist, by contrast, argues that politics creates the social field. So it's not that groups that are created by the economy then go and prevail in politics. It's that politics is creating what groups are significant and endowed with agency, imbued with agency. So this idea, which Delphi shares with the radical democratic pluralism of Leclos and Mouffe, is that politics does not begin from groups, but rather begins by creating them. Delphi's focus is on a single historically specific instance of group creation, the differentiation of women from men, and she theorizes that by way of its material and ideological dynamics. Now, there is an irony in assigning Delphi to the radical pluralist post-Marxist tradition when she is famous for proposing that women can and should be understood politically as a class. But I put her with Leclos and Mouffe because I want to underscore the power of Delphi's work, which is her prizing the social apart from the natural, which is this notion that it is politics that creates the social field. Now, Delphi falls short on what I believe to be the next step, which is then theorizing the relationship between the social and the political. If the political creates the social, what then activates the social? What gets those social entities that politics has created, what gets them moving? Delphi makes no mention of the need to hail women into their class. It is as if for her calling them a class is enough for them to act together as such. As a consequence, she cannot recognize the central message of feminist politics post-WLM, which is that not every feminist responds to being hailed as a woman. Delphi expects that they can be, and that specifying the structures and dynamics of patriarchy will be enough to unite them. Patriarchy is a focus of her analysis because she assumes that feminist politics follows from patriarchal oppression. In this context, woman as class has become a shortcut. Although it is not a natural grouping, she expects it to give rise readily, if not entirely spontaneously, to a political grouping. And I do think that's a shortcoming in her work because, as we know from all the work that we've done, it does not happen that easily. So thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, my name is Lori Marso, and I teach political and feminist theory at Union College in Schenectady, New York. And I'm going to be talking about Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, continuing with the French theme, apparently. The second sex looms large within the backdrop of what has been called second-wave feminism, not only in academic discourse, but also in the women's liberation movements of the 1970s in France, in the United States, and beyond. Just to consider a few examples of the impact of its legacy, we might think about the film by Penny Foster, Daughters of de Beauvoir, charting the influence of the second sex through interviews with Kate Millett, Marge Piercy, Eva Figs, Anne Oakley, regular housewives, and global activists. Betty Friedan, too, acknowledged her debt to the second sex, and Shulamit Firestone, who Kathi will be talking about, dedicated the dialectic of sex in 1970 to, quote, Simone de Beauvoir, who endured. Why, however, look to the second sex now? If we're specifically seeking insight for feminist politics, we might conclude that the second sex should be acknowledged, but not necessarily read. After all, however brilliant Beauvoir might be, what she said in the 1949 text is bound to be historically dated. If looking for philosophical insight, we should note that were we sensitive to Beauvoir's own criticisms of claims to universality preferred by traditional philosophy, we should see the second sex as historically situated and limited by a particular perspective produced in a unique moment. In a less generous vein, we might say that the second sex is applicable only to mid-century French women, or that despite a sort of half-hearted nod to inclusivity and diversity, as the criticism goes, Beauvoir's argument is intrinsically limited by the white intellectual perspective she reproduces as its author. With these limitations in mind, we may be left wondering what the second sex could possibly impart to today's readers. Indeed, even when it was first published, people didn't know what to do with it. It would be an understatement to say that the second sex inspired a lot of emotional responses. Listen to how Beauvoir describes response to the book in her 1963 autobiographical text, Force of Circumstance. These are her words. Unsatisfied, frigid, priapic, nymphomaniac, lesbian, 100 times aborted, I was everything, even an unmarried mother. People offered to cure me of my frigidity or to temper my labial appetites. I was promised revelations in the coarsest terms, but in the name of the true, the good, and the beautiful, in the name of health and even of poetry, all unworthily trampled underfoot by me. End quote. Beauvoir goes on for several pages documenting violent and aggressive responses to her book. In an opposing stance, itself emotional but still deeply ambivalent, Beauvoir was cast as the mother of feminism, a label that she disavowed in a 1974 interview, remarking that, quote, mother-daughter relationships are generally catastrophic. And she goes on, people don't tend to listen to what their mothers are telling them. Her text has also been called the feminist Bible, even though Beauvoir herself was an atheist. And although we almost have now 70 years of distance from the text, it still solicits violent responses. Reviewing the new 2010 translation in the New York Times, for instance, Francine Duplessis-Gray says, quote, Beauvoir's truly paranoid hostility toward the institutions of marriage and motherhood, another characteristic of early feminism, is so extreme as to be occasionally hilarious. She goes on to say, the reviewer, that, quote, pessimism runs through the text like a poisonous river, although she reassures us Beauvoir did not hate men. These responses do give pause. Is there something about the text, in addition to its subject matter, that solicits such strong reactions? I will highlight Beauvoir's conversational style in her famous text, drawing attention to questions of form and how the form, in this case conversation, reveals as well as solicits particular kinds of affective responses. Paying attention to these features of the text will show, I think, why we, early 21st century subjects living in what has been called a post-feminist age, ought to read this book again. Now more than ever, situated as we are in a moment where we're cast as neoliberal, individuated, power, profit, pleasure, or recognition-seeking subjects, and we find ourselves searching for ways to connect and find a collective political voice, the second sex can be one guide. It is diagnostic in its keen critical analysis, positive in its ability to imagine the world anew, but never prognostic. Key to Beauvoir's method and message is her choice of form, the conversation, and the effective moments it reveals as well as solicits. Like the ending of most conversations, the second sex reveals some features of our world and relationships that we didn't see before, but it promises nothing. It portends no certain future. Rather, Beauvoir leaves it up to us to find our way via politics that is localized, affective, and agonistic. In the second sex, Beauvoir stages a series of conversations across multiple borders, a choice of literary style that I think has some striking features in common with the political practice of consciousness-raising groups during the US women's liberation movement. Additionally, we should notice that the text is an experimentation in cross and intradisciplinarity, putting biology, literature, qualitative sociological record, history, economics, psychology, and political science all into conversation about the hierarchy of sexual difference. The writing style she chooses reveals Beauvoir's investment in conversation as inclusive and open, but also potentially transformative by soliciting and nurturing judgments. What we're able to see when we pay specific attention to how the text formally unfolds is that Beauvoir seeks to solicit judgment about our shared world and its meanings. The conversation she stages both expose and undermine good and bad feelings about gender and belonging that are the products of patriarchal oppression, as well as show how ideology and myth-making are themselves a product of male anxiety. Beauvoir asks us, via the conversation she constructs within the text and solicits beyond the text, to revisit and explore the anxiety produced by sexual differences and several differences, turn away from myth, ideology, and structures of oppression to embrace ambiguity, to better imagine our world, and to radically recreate its meanings. Thus, her choice of conversational style, or talking about women, as she colloquially puts it, simultaneously gives credence to diverse and unconventional claims to authority from the body, from women's experience, from heterogeneous locations, as well as unmasks and debunks traditional masculine claims to authority produced and reproduced in science, psychoanalysis, historical materialism, religion, and literature. The conversation that Beauvoir constructs and the way she invites multiple perspectives into her text by experimenting with this style is, I will argue, especially adept for political thinking true to conditions of freedom as non-sovereignty, intersubjectivity, and an enactment of future possibilities for collective political action. Indeed, conversation for Beauvoir works both within and beyond the text as an affective and emotive political appeal to bring a new community of women into being, but one that is not founded on any natural or already existing identity that awaits to be discovered. Discussing form necessitates that I also note Beauvoir's attention to affect, as I already have, since the conversational form tracks and evokes affective states, conditions, and configurations of feeling. I'm interested in Beauvoir's attention to an analysis of the emotions of men and the multiple women that she puts into conversation, both real women and fictional women, the structures of feeling that conditions women's lived experience, in quotes, and finally, the affect generated in reader responses to the text. I argue that Beauvoir demonstrates that affective emotional states create themselves specific political assemblages, organizations, and modes of being that are themselves noticeable and irreducible to the workings of structures and ideologies. Not only does Beauvoir note that the dominant masculine response to the human predicament of embodiment and finitude precipitate feelings of hostility, fear, and anxiety that result in the creation of myths and ideologies about sexual difference, or what Christine Delphi would call gender, she argues furthermore that women too absorb and replicate these emotions and attitudes. Female melancholy, narcissism, anxiety, shame, and investment in romance enhance patriarchal structures and ideologies, and themselves substantially contribute to the obstruction of women's individual and collective political agency, while also potentially signaling dissent, or at the very least, discomfort with the way things are. Ultimately, the form of the text itself invites new conversations. It unfolds as an emotive political appeal, producing this community beyond the text, inviting readers to participate themselves to make judgments and create a different future. I see Beauvoir's argument as occurring in three interrelated moments. First, structural conditions of oppression arrive from the myth of woman, capital W, an ideology produced contingently via political meanings about sexual difference assigned to bodies to reduce the complexity, contingency, and indeterminacy of biological, historical, and psychoanalytical data, and that are themselves a product of an effective state. Male hostility and fear in response to bodily facticity and imminence. Second, these constructed meanings perpetuate inequality, making men transcendent and women imminent, Beauvoir's famous argument, to produce conditions of patriarchal oppression that are bolstered by both good feelings, participation and belonging to a woman's culture of femininity, and the sorts of bad or ugly feelings, shame, narcissism, melancholy, thwarted desire, when one falls outside the boundary or inadequately belongs to. These emotions and affective assemblages are not quite captured by an analysis of power, structures, or ideology, and yet they're key to exploring more precisely why and how women's agency and freedom are obstructed within patriarchal systems, and whether or how they might express dissent. Third, and perhaps ironically, Beauvoir's text brings another affective moment into play via her chosen form of conversation, the appeal to readers to break from oppressive gender bonds and dissociate from femininity in order to create a new future. Beauvoir introduces her topic of conversation, a book on woman, in an ironically dismissive way. She says that, quote, the subject is irritating, especially for women, and it is not new. Indeed, quote, enough ink has flowed over the quarrel about feminism. It is now almost over. Let's not talk about it anymore. Yet it's still being talked about, end quote. There is no doubt by opening the book, we've stumbled upon a creative and sometimes baffling textual beast, one that has confused, delighted, and angered many. Introducing woman as a subject that is suitable, although irritating, to talk about, the text unfolds as two sequential parts of an extended conversation. Or we might think of it as like attending two dinner parties with different guests talking about the same topic during back-to-back evenings. Book one features male authority figures. Scientists, historians, psychoanalysts, philosophers, playwrights, religious men, and novelists declaiming on the roots, legitimacy, and meanings of sexual difference. Introduced to diverse women in book two, the conversation gets more heated, and we see the world from a new perspective. Here we meet famous and minor characters from fiction, authors of autobiographies, Beauvoir's friends and acquaintances, actresses, prostitutes, wives, mothers, girlfriends, girls, and friends, sharing the lived experience, the very different lived experiences of becoming women. One of the techniques that Beauvoir employs throughout the first volume of The Second Sex is to give male authority figures their own space to speak for themselves and in conversation with other authority figures, while at the same time that she undermines, sometimes explicitly and sometimes in more subtle ways, their assumed right to shape, determine, and dominate conversation. Beauvoir admits early on that she, quote, used to get annoyed in abstract discussions to hear men tell her, you think such and such because you're a woman, end quote. In response to this conversation stopper, Beauvoir says a woman is forced to answer, quote, I think it because it is true, end quote, rather than, quote, you think the contrary because you are a man. It's understood that a man is in his right by virtue of being a man. It's a woman who's in the wrong. Today, I think that in most instances, a woman can hold her own, if not carry the day, possibly, by responding, you think the contrary because you're a man. Yet this assertion of equal particularity or equally shared and competing claims to authority via subjectivity or experience, much like the new proliferation of gender identities or the right to marry one who you happen to love regardless of gender, does not ultimately serve to undermine masculine authority and norms of bourgeois ideology. I suggest that Beauvoir is doing something a bit different and far more radical and potentially transformative than to just simply add more voices to the mix when she stages conversations in the second sex. And I'll return to this point in just a few minutes. Another textual technique at play is Beauvoir's mimicking of male voices in what can sometimes be a confusing patchwork that sometimes results in readers not knowing who or what position Beauvoir is endorsing. She does indeed warn us about her strategy. She says, "It is noteworthy that physiologists and biologists all use a more or less finalistic language merely because they ascribe meaning, in this case gendered hierarchical meaning, to vital phenomena. We will use their language," end quote. But she also steps in at key moments, aggressively inserting herself into the conversation to make a pointed and often damning observation. Commenting on the conclusion that the ovum is likened to immanence and the sperm to transcendence, for example, Beauvoir says, quote, "In truth, these are merely ramblings," end quote. As readers, though, we have to be attentive. We must never turn away from the conversation because we might lose the thread. Then we might lose track of who's speaking when, as in several instances, Beauvoir cedes the floor to a misogynistic male scientist or historian who conjures images of devouring femininity and woman's dream of castration. Where do these images come from? Beauvoir notes repeatedly in the chapter on facts that it is male emotion that clouds judgment. Anxiety, fear, and disgust are common male responses to biological realities and historical contingencies. Chapter 1 on biological data, for example, begins by noting that the term woman, when uttered by those who like simple answers, is pejorative not because it roots woman in nature, but rather due to the disquieting hostility woman triggers in man. Likewise, myths, too, are a response to certain ugly or at least unsettling and uncomfortable feelings, such as anxiety. Myths rescue men from the existential dilemma of longing for both life and rest, existence and being. They cast woman as the embodied dream, the perfect intermediary between nature that's too foreign to man and the peer who's too identical to him. What unfolds in the first volume of The Second Sex, then, highlights some of the political features of Beauvoir's keen interest in affective and emotional states revealed in conversation. Put into staged conversation with each other, male authorities reveal their affective preoccupations, and these are listed by Beauvoir as fear, disgust, repulsion, hostility, and anxiety. Women are drawn into this conversation, too, by the demand to, quote, be women, stay women, become women. And in fact, there are good feelings generated by the comfort one receives from belonging to a community of women who embrace and manage femininity, and these bad or ugly feelings about belonging inexpertly. However, what she wagers is that these conversations will utilize and initiate also new conversations to help us make judgments about patriarchal structures. So as Beauvoir reminds us, seeking meaning through identification with gods, myth, humanity, or any universal destroys the space between us and thus destroys politics. Politics, which entails making an appeal to an other or to others, is necessary and yet offers no guarantee of response, understanding, and never closure, since we can never know the mind of an other or even really represent it to ourselves. Theorized as, quote, an endless becoming, Beauvoir sees each person's point of departure as creating requirements and appeals to which only the creation of new requirements will respond, end quote. This open, never-ending appeal and potential response of individual subjectivities, each themselves breaking the bonds of preset identities, happens within a context where our judgment alone allows us to examine the conditions of our lives. Because there exists no heaven, she says, where the reconciliation of human judgments is accomplished, end quote, and because we are each singularly situated but necessary in our freedom as the foundation for the existence of others, it's only through reaching out to others in their freedom that we can create a new and potentially liberating future. The formal conditions of conversation, then, that there must be, as she says, men ready to hear me close by, and that these men are my peers, end quote, is both met and not met in The Second Sex. There are men close by, that they're not ready to hear Beauvoir's voice. Recall the many harsh reviews she received from men that I mentioned at the beginning of these comments, as well as the emotional responses from women. She also says, though, that many, both men and women, heard and responded to the appeal. Beauvoir says she's told the book sometimes, quote, helped women. And she says this is partly because it partially expressed them, and they, in turn, gave it its truth. Could it be the case that hearing the female complaint, as she said it, learning the truth of the origins of myths in male anxiety and fear, and making space for conversation is what feminism is about? Do these acts themselves create the possibility to encourage collective action? If we read The Second Sex as an appeal to solicit our judgments and consider feminism to be an unending, open, and necessary conversation, we can see the text as a political conversation that, rather than being, quote, now almost over, end quote, is instead perpetually new.
I'm Kathi Weeks, and I teach women's studies at Duke University. And I'm going to present parts of a paper on Shulamith Firestone, focusing mostly on the dialectic of sex. In feminist theory, the 70s has, until recently, been most often remembered, or at best misremembered, as the time when feminists made mistakes. We essentialized the category of women, so the story goes, neglected race, constructed maniacally totalizing theories, and embarrassed ourselves in public with our intemperate speech, overwrought emotions, and utopian dreams. Sometimes it's as if the whole period is now only recalled within scare quotes. The daring and ambition of feminist thinkers and activists in the 1970s is often recoded in the historical memory of the field as naivete and failure. This is not a matter of mere inattention. The shame and disavowal that often characterize feminism's own historiography suggests that there's a more active mode of forgetting at work. I'm interested in exploring the relationship between the feminist present, its recent past, and its possible futures, using Shulamith Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex from 1970 as a point of reference. Rather than conceive 1970s feminism as either a dead relic of a superseded past or a living legacy, I want to think about the temporalities of feminist theory in ways that can account both for continuity and rupture, for our attractions and repulsions, for the possibility that any moment could generate both inspiration and cautionary tales, and that each of these judgments could be leveled both backward and forward in time. The discussion of feminist time that follows centers on three concepts designed to animate different dimensions of Firestone's legacy, each of which offers a specific way of thinking about the relationship among past, present, and future. The first of these poses the dialectic of sex as a vanishing mediator. The second reads the contrast between Firestone's earlier and later book as an allegory of the present. And the third presents the dialectic of sex as an archive of the future. And I'm actually not going to have time to talk about those three categories, so I'll just say something about what I do with each of them, and then I go on for another introductory section. So first, the vanishing mediator. The category is borrowed from Frederick Jameson's analysis of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Jameson used the concept to describe Max Weber's argument about the role of the Protestant work ethic, which helped to create the secular spirit of capitalism that then undercut the religious basis of the original ethic. So it was sort of a mediator between the pre- and capitalist world that then gets destroyed by the capitalist world that it creates. One of the attractions of using Jameson's concept to think about feminist time is that, unlike other models of linear history, whether secured by narratives of progress or regress, metaphors of familial filiation or rebellion, or dialectical logics of recuperation and synthesis, the vanishing mediator can account for unexpected leaps and qualitative disjunctions. As Jameson describes this aspect of Weber's historical method, the Protestant ethic is not merely a transition figure, or, with apologies to Firestone, a midwife that prepares the way for a future that supersedes it. It serves the more dramatic function of a bearer of change that sows the seeds of its own extinction. So what's so interesting and poorly understood is how and why early 1970s radical feminism, though partially absorbed later into liberal feminism, transmogrified beyond recognition into cultural feminism, and incorporated into what was then a new project called socialist feminism, largely dies out. Instead of the midwife, perhaps the better analogy, once again, apologies to Firestone, is the surrogate mother who's not just overlooked once the child is produced, but is actively excised from the family photos. As a vanishing mediator between the pre-feminist past and the feminist present, the dialectic of sex and radical feminism more broadly were later disavowed by the project they helped to create. Feminist theory since the 1970s has, and with this formulation, I owe even more apologies to Firestone, thrown out too many babies with the bathwater. I just can't, the babies just kept coming when I talked about her. Right, so we end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We throw out the critique of personal choice along with prescriptivism, systematizing structuralist analyses along with totalizing theory, collective feminist subjects with essentialist identity categories, and we toss out the possibilities of a genderless future in the name of gender diversity and inclusivity. And that's not the crankiest part of the paper, right? So first of all, I think of it as a kind of vanishing mediator between the feminist past and its present, which then disavows that past. And then second, I use the contrast between the dialectic of sex and Shulamith Firestone's only other book called Airless Spaces, published in 1998. As an allegory of the present of feminist theory, and this is definitely the crankiest part of the paper. And some of this is captured in the difference between the genres of the two works. So one, the dialectic of sex is really a manifesto, and I'll go on to talk more about that. Airless Spaces takes the form of a diary. The focus of one, dialectic of sex, is world historical. The other one focuses on daily life. Dialectic of sex works in an expansive temporality that ranges from the distant past to some far-off future that she's willing to speculate about. Airless Spaces is narrowed in its temporality. It focuses on only the most recent past, the last few days until the present. Right, so I use that as an allegory of what I see as feminist theory's more backward-looking temporalities today, and the kind of affects, including, and habits of thinking like, irony, skepticism, melancholy, which have replaced the kind of joy and rage and sarcasm that we find in 1970s feminism, and particularly in Shulamith Firestone's Dialectic of Sex. And then in the third section, I return again to Dialectic of Sex, and I find aspects of her critical project and utopian vision useful as an archive with relevance to the present. And I'm really interested there, both in her critiques of work and family, but also her constructive utopian proposals for a guaranteed basic income, which I think is a very useful reform, and a proposal for a post-familial social order. And I think those are incredibly relevant today in a way that maybe they weren't even as much in the 1970s when she wrote this. So I'm particularly interested in using these three conceptual tools to direct our critical gaze not to the past, but rather to use the past as a lens through which to examine the present status of feminist theory. But first, and also by way of an introduction to the text, I want to say something more about Firestone's choice of genre for her first book. The Dialectic of Sex is a paradigmatic 1970s text, one that captures and indeed takes to an extreme many of the contradictions at the heart of U.S. feminism in that moment. In keeping with that unwieldy category radical feminism, the book is at once representative of the label and utterly idiosyncratic. As a manifesto, it is a temporary text drafted in and for a specific historical moment, yet it's also considered a classic of the feminist canon. Perhaps even more than other texts of the period, the dialectic is both an artifact of the consciousness-raising practices of activist groups and the creation of an individual thinker. It is the product of feminist common sense and an achievement of high theory. Again, in ways not uncommon for that period, the author was a proponent of horizontal organization and a charismatic star, committed to feminist egalitarianism, and herself something of a rugged individualist. But most interesting to me, and the primary impetus for this paper, is how both the author and the text are simultaneously present in and absent from our histories, at once acknowledged as central and yet marginalized. It's a text that can still make an entrance and is constantly exiting from the scene. By the time the dialectic was published in 1970, Firestone had already left feminist politics, never to return. And the text itself has often been, as it is once again today, I haven't checked this week, it might be different, out of print. By raising the text vanishing as a puzzle, and as I will go on to claim, a problem, I'm not denying the accuracy of many of the critiques that have been leveled over the years at what Anne Snitow has aptly named feminism's most famous demon text. As a call for world historical feminist revolution, the book is infamous for a long list of reasons, from its insistence on the value of a suspect source like 19th century feminism, to its brazen use of those icons of patriarchal thought, Freud and Marx, from its amusing idea of a smile boycott to its trenchant critiques of heterosexual love, sex, and romance, from its declaration that pregnancy is barbaric and support for artificial reproduction to its spirited defense of children's liberation. Interestingly, some of the book's major sins against feminism change over time. Thus, for example, what Sarah Franklin calls Firestone's techno-optimism is less a problem today when more feminists would rather be cyborgs than goddesses. By contrast, the text's heteronormativity is as troubling as ever, and Firestone's reductive analysis of racism as sexism extended and presentation of racial stereotypes as a psychological portraits are perhaps even more noxious in the absence of the instances of 60s Black nationalist masculinism that was part of her target. But in sorting through the many negative appraisals of the book, it's useful to recognize that many of them are in fact directed at the genre of the utopian manifesto. Indeed, the dialectic is in many ways paradigmatic of that form. As a case in point, consider Firestone's decidedly undiplomatic tendency to go for the juggler, as in her infamous description of childbirth as akin to shitting a pumpkin, and her declarations that childhood is hell and love a holocaust. This rhetorical stridency is unadulterated manifesto speak. She does not deign to address her skeptics, let alone meet them halfway. As in other manifestos, Firestone speaks to the feminist we that she wants to provoke into formation and arm for action. Recalling Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, who respond to their critics who reproach them for intending to do away with their property, with the answer, precisely so, that's just what we intend. On the opening page, Firestone answers the claim of a different audience. That? Why, you can't change that. You must be out of your mind. With the simple affirmation that, yes, she was indeed, quote, talking about something every bit as deep as that, end quote. The final claim of that first paragraph, an instance of pure feminist bravado, exemplifies the tone and tenor of the entire text. Quote, if there were another word more all-embracing than revolution, we would use it, end quote. The dialectic is not only a utopian manifesto, it is, as Mandy Merck and Stella Stanford observe, one of the more utopian of utopian manifestos. This is best illustrated in the final chapter, wherein Firestone explicitly defends speculations about dangerously utopian proposals and offers for her contribution to that project a vision of cybernetic post-familial communism. To adapt Anne Snitow's observation about Firestone's utopian writing to the more specific genre of the utopian manifesto, quote, part of the demonizing of the text arises out of a misreading of the genre, end quote. This includes a too literal, or perhaps just humorless reading of the manifesto's theatricality, as well as a tendency to take its vision of the future as a blueprint rather than as an effort to, as Firestone described it, to stimulate thinking in fresh areas rather than to dictate the action, end quote. To think further about how to read the text as a utopian manifesto, I want to focus for a moment on one of the text's signature moves, the insistence that the oppression of women is grounded in nature. For Firestone, the gender division of both productive and reproductive labor is fundamental to the sex-class system, but by her account, the division of labor is founded on biological reproduction. There are a number of ways to interpret this critical claim. One could, for example, read it as a simple case of mistaking a biological cause for a social one. By this reading, Firestone mimics anti-feminism's naturalization of inequality. The limitation of this analysis is its failure to do justice to Firestone's more complicated understanding of both the social construction of gender and of the mutability of nature. Rather than a matter of falling for and replicating anti-feminism's biological essentialism, one could just as easily read Firestone's claim as a smart political tactic. Instead of swimming against the tide, she first accepts the argument that inequality is natural and then pulls the rug out from under it by characterizing it as an historical argument irrelevant to the future. As Firestone explains it, quote, "To grant that the sexual imbalance of power is biologically based is not to lose our case," end quote, because, and it is important to register her use of quotation marks here, the natural is not necessarily a human value, end quote. While I'm sympathetic to both of those readings of Firestone's argument about the natural foundation of women's oppression, there's a third interpretation that we should consider as well. This one reads the assertion in the context of the Utopian Manifesto, a genre with its own reading protocols. For example, we can reinterpret the claim about the biological basis of gender oppression in relation to the two key functions of the utopian form. The first of these is critical, to use the possibility of a better future to shed light on and raise questions about the present. From this perspective, the implication of Firestone's argument, namely that it may be more realistic and politically feasible to eliminate the biological division of reproductive labor than the social gendered one, is thought-provoking to say the least. The argument invites us to consider whether the plasticity and adaptability of gender makes it in some ways a more elusive target than the rather simple and innocent nature of nature that undergirds the anti-feminist analysis. Rather than a capitulation to biological essentialism, the argument could be seen as the ultimate, because so literal, example of feminist denaturalization. The second function of the utopian text is to stimulate the imagination of a different future. From this perspective, one could read Firestone's technological fix of the biological origin of inequality as a more a means to kickstart the imagination of a radically transformed future than as an end in itself. Consider her musing on the final page of the text, a dare to just try to imagine this, that someday, after the feminist revolution, pregnancy might still be indulged in, but only as, quote, a tongue-in-cheek archaism, just as already women today wear virginal white to their weddings, end quote. By this reading, the possibility of extrauterine reproduction as one option among others serves here as a deus ex machina. Reproductive technology plays a role in setting the stage for her utopian vision of a cybernetic post-familial communism comparable to that of a spaceship in a work of utopian science fiction that transports us to a different world from which we can look back on our own and imagine a possible alternative, or at least the possibility of an alternative. By bringing to the text a reading protocol more appropriate to the utopian manifesto form, we might linger somewhat less on the residual modes of somatophobia and techno-determinism that may animate or be fueled by her proposal, than on where they take us and what horizons they might open up for us. So I'll just go to the end, skip the cranky parts, and then yeah, it's just saw it like that. Firestone's dialectic of sex poses interesting problems and possibilities for thinking about feminism's relationship to the 1970s. First, more than any other text from that period, it contains both the best and worst of radical feminist theory. In this single text, one can locate examples of every negative characterization of feminism's disgraced past, from its remarkable inability to think adequately about race and sexuality, to its essentialist formulations and universalizing claims. But for this reason, the text can help to remind us that we must always be selective in our use of the feminist past, an insight that the temporal models of legacies, inheritance, and foremothers, whether honored or disowned, cannot as effectively sustain. Second, the problem of how to read 70s feminism today is particularly complicated given the genre of the dialectic. The Utopian Manifesto is a prime example of what Jacqueline Rhodes calls a temporary text, written to a particular audience and from a specific location. At the same time, however, it may be that the importance of approaching all historical texts, not only selectively, but also within a contemporary horizon of problems and possibilities, is only more obvious in the case of a text that is so clearly of its time. Finally, while it is certainly valuable to study this artifact of the feminist past from the perspective of the accumulated knowledge and experience available to us in the present, I have tried to demonstrate that it might be equally worthwhile to reverse our critical gaze, to use the past as a standpoint from which to think critically about the present. And the dialectic offers, I think, a rich storehouse of possibilities for this project. Thank you. A lot of time for questions, so.
Questions, comments, testimony, political appeals.
Yeah.
Yes. This is a lazy question.
Yay.
If you want to, as I do, follow what happened to Firestone's biography after the dialectic of sense, what's a good channel for that? What's a good, is there anything online?
So where to find information about Firestone's life?
After the dialectic of sex, since she left radical feminism.
Well, I think the other text would then be Airless Spaces, which was published in 1998, I think, by Semiotext, and it's a very small book that's a series of vignettes about her own experience, but mostly other people's experiences coming in and out of mental institutions, and sort of the hardships that they face coming out. And so some of them are about stories of people she knew, others it doesn't really explain if it's just a character or someone she knew. And it's a very powerful and spare and bleak account, but also really brilliantly written. And like compared to the dialectic of sex, where you just read it and the kind of the rage and the humor just roll off in waves, that text is just almost sort of affectively spare and neutral, kind of leaving you to your own devices as a reader to deal with it. So I would definitely go there.
Did you mean also, though, just literally what she did after?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh. I think the piece by Susan Faludi in, when was it?
She said it's terrible.
No, really.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
To speak out of turn.
No, go ahead.
Two just tiny little points. When I graduated from this institution in 1965, I got a master's in literature, and then what young women did then, they became editorial secretaries. And my boss published the dialectic of sex. So I knew her slightly. And about 6 months ago, I got a call from him. We've stayed in touch over the years, and he wanted me to speak to Susan Faludi because he knew the piece was being put together. And I took a pass because I felt that there was nothing that I could do to stop the train. And that was right.
Does anyone, I don't know about any other biographies. There's a lot of secondary literature about it.
When she died, a number of people who knew her wrote obituaries.
Oh, yes,
and there's
yes.
a website. I
Yeah.
assume it's still
It
there.
is still up,
And
yeah.
it has recollections of various of her friends.
Yeah,
from the time.
yeah, that was nice.
Where is that?
It's
It was a website,
online.
I forget what, I don't have the link. But
Yeah.
It was an obituary site for.
Reminiscences,
What?
Reminiscence, I think. Just, I think if you
Firestone.
Google.
Alice Eccles wrote it, Snittow wrote,
Yeah.
a whole bunch of people wrote
Yeah.
really really nice little recollections.
Yeah.
Well, we had a memorial service for her in New York City.
Yes, I think there's a video of it.
And were there texts produced out of that
Well, some of the writings ended up.
in there?
Great.
She was very reclusive at the end. She wouldn't even see her best friends at all. She wouldn't open the door. They couldn't even come up to the fire escape. She was just trying to be alone for a long, long time.
What's the critique of the Faludi piece?
Yeah.
What's the critique of it? What it does, and I don't want to.
It's in the New Yorker.
No, I read it. I want to know what the critique is.
She died in 2012.
No, very briefly, it goes back to what was happening in New York at the time in our movement. And the author of the piece has certain opinions which she supports with her particular, it's really too complicated to go into right now. But I think that what she did was use the mental illness as a kind of smokescreen and excuse for the political brilliance of the dialectical sex. That would be my very short.
Yeah, I read it differently, but I mean, it might be that there's going to be different interpretations of it too. I didn't see it as sort of in any way negating the power of the analysis by talking about them. Is that what you're saying, that in some ways? Yeah, I didn't read it that way, but.
The red stockings put on the Marsers, and those people are here at the conference. We're close friends of hers, and would be able to answer some of these questions. Close friends of hers.
Really wonderful panel. Thank you so much. I have a question about Christina Thief, in part because I read her many, many years ago and have been stunned that she is not a more canonical figure in women's studies in the United States. But my question, the thing I remember about her, and I could be remembering, so you feel free to correct me, but was finding her so compelling for expressing what I saw in a lot of Latin American feminists talking about, and non-Western feminists talking about not just a critique of a gender division of labor, but also a critique of the valorization of different kinds of labor. The problem that the solution was not to get women into more male-dominated fields, which is what a lot of feminists were pushing for in the 70s, but rather to really reimagine how we understand commodification and capitalism. And I mean, it was really it seemed like a much more radical and thoroughgoing critique of the economic system in which we continue to live than I saw anyplace else at the time. And maybe I just don't, I'm really stuck mostly in Latin America, so I'm just curious how representative she was, and also I guess probably was she reading some of these critiques that were coming from what we now call the global south, but then definitely from the third world, that were, I think, pretty stridently anti-capitalist, and really not seeing the solution as just sort of commodifying women's labor.
Right. No, I don't know if she was reading those critiques or not. She, in both the things that she has to say about gender and the things that she has to say about labor, what she wants is a post-gender future. And so, which of course was, some people read that as liberalism, but that's an incredibly flat way to read that notion, because I think the way you put it is really nice, that what troubles her is the valorization of some forms of labor as higher because they are done by men, and other forms of labor as lower. And what she wants to do is to crash that value system, rather than have women doing the higher. It's again a critique of the domination that's wrought through gender.
Right.
So no, that's really great the way you put that. Oh, thank you.
Could you say, Lisa, a little bit more about why you think, or what you think is interesting about the fact that Delphi rejected the sex-gender distinction before Butler did, on the basis of social structural, not psychological, or psychoanalytic, or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
And why? And what can we learn from that, and what can we bring to theorizing today from rediscovering that?
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question a little bit?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I can repeat the question. Anne just asked me to say a little bit more about what I think is interesting that Delphi does the sex-gender critique that we associate with Butler. I think Delphi's doing something slightly, she is doing it, but she's adding something, but also that Delphi approaches that sociologically rather than psychoanalytically. So I think one thing that's really interesting about it, I mean, first of all, I think that what Butler emphasizes is the naturalization of sex by gender. And I don't get, I mean, I think this notion of principle of partition is really fascinating, and that it's not just about naturalizing, but it's also about giving sex the possibility of grouping. I think that that's a really interesting argument that Delphi is making, and I think I lose, when I'm not reading my prose, I lose the grasp on exactly what I mean by that. But, so I do think that's a little bit different, or there's slightly something added to Butler. But I also think that what has happened to us is that we think that if you do a constructivist analysis of sex, and if you say that sex is not there, we have sex because we have gender, we think, okay, that's a linguistic analysis. We've lost touch with materiality once we've done that. And so we identify it as a deconstructionist move, and that we're really talking about the relationship of two linguistic signifiers. And so what I really appreciate about Delphi is that she comes at this through thinking about the division of labor. And she's certainly not saying that that's not real, but what she really wants to say is that does not arise out of sex. There's just no natural basis for that deliberation, for that division of labor. The division of labor is pure domination, and therefore it must be understood in terms of gender. And we have to understand that it's gender that assigns the natural basis to the division of labor. And this, I think, is just really amazing, because she remains a materialist. This isn't just about linguistic categories. And it's so out of step with so much of the feminist work that was being done then, which really, especially the American which wasn't psychoanalytic, but objects relations theory, that really rooted all of this in a sexual division of labor that was just really literally about different natural roles in childbearing. And so I think the radicalism of this, that does a materialist analysis of bodies that are working bodies instead of reproducing bodies, and that remains materialist, but that refuses to concede sex a reality as the kind of big difference that we make it to be. I just think it's really amazingly radical.
Can I just jump in here for a second too, Lisa?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's interesting, though, to go back to the second sex on these questions as well, because in Beauvoir's chapter on biology, she too questions the partitioning into groups based on sex, and talks about how this, what she calls are having to sacrifice to the species for all species, and how women are sacrificed, or the female function is sacrificed more the higher up you go in terms of the human chain, makes it such that attends to this possibility of putting sex into categories. She also looks at this question of the division of labor, because she does this long reading of Engels on the origins of private property in the state, origins of family private property in the state, and thinks about how that analysis of historical materialism too misses something in terms of not being able to look at the complexity of biological realities. So she's very materialist in trying to think through vital, active, in-process kinds of modes of being in nature, to which we assign certain kinds of meanings, and that in itself, like I think you've so well articulated about Delphi, is a political process that she looks at through her chapters on biology and psychoanalysis and historical materialism, and in literature and religion, myth-making across the board, and tries to, that's what I think is fascinating about that conversation across disciplines as well. So.
Victoria,
mentioning.
you
Hi.
Hi.
I'm sorry I was late to the panel, story of my life, but so I missed the first two papers, so I apologize for that. But I wanted to ask Kathi, I loved your paper.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I really appreciated that you kind of raised the question of the theatricality of the text from that period. And to take up your suggestion that we use the past to think about the present, do you see in the present an ability on the part of feminists, political activists, to engage more specifically feminists, to engage different kinds of genres of writings? It seems to me that one of the reasons why those texts have been misread is because we don't allow women to have a great range of public voice, especially when it comes to politics. So we might agree with Belant that the only public voice that women are allowed is the complaint, or not, but I wonder if we have more variety now.
No, I think that's interesting too. I mean, and I mean, there's other aspects of the text that I think represent forms of writing and speaking that we don't find anymore. And some of this, and I'm always questioning myself and interrogating my own deep attraction to this text, because I don't want it to be just nostalgic, you know. And so I'm trying to sort through, you know, what aspects of the text do I appreciate, and can some of these be replicated today? And I think some of it, you know, the kind of joy and rage and, you know, excitement were part of a product of what we keep talking about, is this revolutionary moment where we can't just pretend we're in right now. But also there's this kind of like, and people have talked about Firestone's willingness in this text to take every kind of intellectual risk, every kind of political risk. I mean, she's not afraid to fail. And we're very afraid to fail. I mean, you can't fail anymore. I mean, you know, you won't get tenure, right? I mean, you can't fail. I mean, and so you know, I love that sort of do-it-yourself ethos of it, and that's something I really miss.
So it's a kind of public intellectual.
Yeah, right.
Harder to get.
But at this point, you know, we are responsible for, you know, 50 years of feminist work that we need to cite and be responsible. I mean, you know, it's sort of like, you just can't pretend that we can, you know, engage in that kind of fly by the seat of your pants theorizing, even though I miss it and I love to read it. So, I mean, I think there's other ways that the kind of writing isn't available to us. And in some ways, I think, I don't know if we can just recapture it, but in other ways, like, and I think part of what's consistent with this utopian manifesto is this willingness to talk about futures and to speculate and to urge people to think and provoke them to think and shake them until they think about possible alternatives. And I think that's something that I do think we can do today, and that we don't do it. And so I really do like, you know, part of the book is, you know, again, it ranges from the ancient past to the future, and there's these famous sort of diagrams, you know, about world history. And then there's like prehistory over here, and then middle history, and then like more than half of the graph takes place in the future. It's like, and then the farthest revolution, you know, and she's like outlining it, not in terms of a blueprint, but she's so willing to think into the future. And I think we're very willing to think into the past and very frightened about thinking in the future. And I think a lot of our skills have withered for lack of use. And I think that's something that we can recapture, unlike other aspects of it. So thanks for the question.
I have a comment. Oh, did you?
Yes, go. Yes.
I have a comment, and that is that it's too bad that we don't have a session allocated to feminist theories from 2/3 of the women that compose the feminist movement, and that is Asian American, Native American, Latin American, and Chicanas. Because this theory,
Black women.
I'm sorry, African American women. This theory is Eurocentric, and it is definitely Anglo-American theory. We all learned it, so we could have a common language, like we all learned to speak English in addition to other languages. But what we worked in our community and continue to work in our communities has been a feminism based on our own feminist traditions and theories. And this is from the colonial time. We know they were feminists in the colonial times. For us, it's from indigenous times to, pre-Hispanic times to Hispanic colonial times to U.S. colonial to the present. And so I just want the young people to know that this is one stream of a mighty river, and that we are not going to make a lot of headway unless we learn, acknowledge, respect, credit feminist theories, because we are in a multicultural nation. If I were in Mexico, oh, it'd be so easy, because I got that down. I just wanted to say that for future scholars, we need to look at this as a mighty river. And we are not going to excuse it away by saying, oh, that's just race theory, that's just sex. It cannot, for us, cannot just be sex theory. And I'm not talking about just us, I'm talking about us. It can't be, because we're not gonna make it. We're not gonna make it with one theory.
There's
Okay,
in the
I'd
back
like to
too.
say something about that. I think that it's very easy for each of us to come from our worldviews, and they're different, and I respect them all. But the one thing I would like to say is that we have one Earth. If the Earth is feminine,
Right.
there is more violence against the Earth than any single human being. She has been raped. And so therefore, I say we unite in that one place and bless the Earth and bless everyone on the Earth, so that is not divisive. It is one unifying thing, and will help us all survive.
The animals too.
There's someone in the back.
Every living thing.
Go ahead.
I want to jump in and sort of piggyback on several of the comments that have been made, because when you were just discussing the possibilities for a different mode or genre of writing feminist theory, I think I question, as somebody who's worked in a women's studies department for 3 decades or so, the extent to which academic feminism in some forms has contributed to this sort of stultifying of the creativity of feminist theory. And I remember when I was teaching feminist theory, and I don't see this, maybe I'm wrong because I've stopped teaching it a decade ago, some of the central text came out of books like Gloria Anzaldua's Borderland La Frontera, or This Bridge Called My Back, which were very different kinds of writing. Barbara Christian's Race for Theory, very different kinds of writing than what gets legitimated as feminist theory. And back to what you were saying about Shulami's work, if you think about a lot of the texts that were original feminist theory texts, they came out of the movement, out of activism, and I want to know where that is today.
Another question.
I think we have to acknowledge that we're in a different historical time with different conditions of the production of all kinds of things. So it's not, I feel like, it's easy to pick on the failures and limitations of academic feminism, but I don't think it's really responsible for the collapse of the feminist movement as an organized, constituency in this country. There's so many things that have contributed to the demobilization of progressive movements altogether. And let's really, to steal a phrase from Christine Delphi, let's remember who the main enemies are. And the other thing is, in terms of thinking about the future, the point was made this morning that there was this moment where we really did think that utopia was around the corner because we could. And when I think about the future now, I find it much scary.
That's right.
And change seems scarier because the changes I can now imagine are not the ones I could imagine in 1970. So let's acknowledge that we're in a different place historically. We have a different mode of production of kinds of literature. It's not just what the academic presses do. They're practically on the death watch now anyway, after the collapse of the mid-list. A lot of these books that were published in the early phases of the women's movement came out of a part of the trade press that almost no longer exists. So, they're really bigger forces that are limiting what we can do and what we think and what we have at our fingertips. And I think it's important to remember them.
Yeah, that's really good.
There's over there, there's 2 folks. Okay.
On the relevance of the war, I'm just really curious, because I'm not an academic, what, to to what extent, if any, did Deirdre Baer's book have on how she is treated in academic?
That's okay. The question is, to what extent, if any, did Deirdre Baer's biography of Simone de Beauvoir have on the way that Beauvoir studies have unfolded in the academy? So were you thinking of something in specific? Because, you know, Deirdre Baer wrote the definitive biography of Simone de Beauvoir. Is there something there that you're thinking about that?
Well, there were a couple, but I can just mention one or two. I mean, she was just, you know, a goddess to me, my friends. And when
De Beauvoir or Deirdre Baer?
Beauvoir. And when we all read, you know,
That biography.
we were crestfallen to learn of the personal details of her.
Oh, so you're thinking about the relationship with Sartre and her sort of submission to him?
Yes, yes. And to the extent to which all of your stuff is, you know, the Foucaultian, you know, psychoanalytic model of how much of her work was in fact some kind of very interesting wish fulfillment.
I did not read that in the Deirdre Baer biography at all. So I have a very different kind of sense of that biography. Yes, things were revealed in terms of some of the archival letters that were exchanged between Sartre and Beauvoir. And many feminists have written about those and what it means. To me, what it means is that that we definitely do not know everything about her, nor will we ever. And while her personal life is important because she made it important, she wanted to live her life as an example, of course, and she wanted to be inspirational. There's been a lot of work that has been done about how the subsuming of Beauvoir's work under Sartre, for example, on the intellectual level is completely wrong, and all this documentation has been done about what were her ideas. And of course, I mean, it's not just her ideas. That's the thing about Christine Delphi, too. I mean, it's a zeitgeist. There's a lot of ideas being exchanged. And so I actually think it's more interesting and fun to read her in conversation, even with Sartre, rather than as separate than him. So there's the personal, and there's their relationship, and there's the political and the relationship philosophically. So yes, there's been much done on that. But I didn't see the biography by Deirdre Baer as being an aha moment or kind of a gotcha moment in terms of Beauvoir wasn't everything we thought she was. I think that's problematic to put her on that stand in the first place, and to think that she had a less complicated life than any of us do.
Let's take one more comment.
Yeah, I don't think we're gonna have time, but I had two strands. One was about the travels of this feminist theory, because I know, like, going back to Latin American feminism, I hear Beauvoir quoted, so I guess so it's been translated into Spanish. But there's an issue there because a lot of Latin American feminist theory doesn't get translated into English for us, so you have to be able to read in Spanish in order to access that. But I wonder if any of you have looked at the translation of these texts, their travels. And then the second question I have, which we probably won't talk about, is how do you teach this in your classroom? Because someone raised what's taught as feminist theory, and how do you teach the 70's feminist theory?
No, I haven't looked into if there's been translations of dialectic of sex, but I think that'd be a fascinating question to explore, and I haven't done it. In terms of teaching 70's feminism, it's all of a sudden a lot easier just recently than it was even 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I think for whatever reason, students are much more interested in treating this as maybe a history that they can approach with some less effectively charged response, so that they're not always wanting to judge it or distance themselves, or it's just interesting and sometimes inspiring and sometimes confounding. I mean, all of a sudden they just seem more willing to go back to that history as any other moment, and that for me is new. Teaching dialectic of sex is an adventure. It's always an adventure. So that's
actually has been translated into Persian.
Oh.
And
Wow.
not only it is read,
group of women who are publishing quarterly called The Second Sex. And every time they have to get permission from the Islamic Republic in order to publish.
Oh, wow.
But they do so, and it's called The Second Sex.
Ooh, there's a book there, Reading Beauvoir. In
Yeah.
Yeah.
They have been.
It's like different than reading Lolita. Yes,
Exactly.
yes, reading Beauvoir.
The next panel's in 10 minutes.
Yes, we
Okay.
should
Yeah.
go. Thank you very
so
much,
much.
everybody.
Thank you.
This is lovely.
Is this when we're supposed to end? We're not late, are we? I think 3:20. Oh, 3:20.